one of the groups of people that helped me along the way was Network Waitangi o Tautahi, a Pākehā Treaty Education Network, who create the most beautiful resources that Pākehā and tangata tiriti can draw on, so that we're not sapping up the resources of tangata whenua to help us unlearn and then relearn the things we need to relearn.
Raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, ki tēnei kōnai ipurangi, ko Ao Mai Te Rā te ingoa. Welcome to Ao Mai Te Rā, a podcast series where we talk about racism in all its forms and how we work to get rid of it. With us today is Josiah Tualamali'i. He is a young leader originally from Te Moana Nui a Kiwa from Hinemoa, and he's been part of the Te Ara Aranga process. So good to have you in the podcast with us today, Josiah. Nau mai. Tell us a bit about yourself and your journey to the roles of really serious responsibility that you're holding at the moment.
Tēnā koe rangatira, ko vai te maunga ko wale ma te aua ko Aotearoa whitu whawhitu toko waka no Otapoti ahau ke Otatahi ino ana. Oranga tangata, oranga whānau toku mahi, ko Josiah Tabitu toko ingoa. Malo lovely soifua. Thank you. A privilege to be with you.
Kia ora.
Yeah, it hasn't been planned, I can put it that way. And my whānau, mum and dad, who both, and my grandma actually, who all in oranga, all in health, never expected it. I didn't either. But how did it start? Well, I guess it goes back to two things. My mum was born in Australia, and our whakapapa on our Balangi side goes back through Scotland and Ireland and Poland. And then Dad came to Aotearoa in the 80s from Samoa, and he grew up in town, in Apia, but our villages are Lepa and Afonga, Salelesi. And he came here to journey, as many of our families do, to support our village and support our whānau. He came here when he was 17, so it was a huge, huge move for him. And jumping forward a little bit, met mum and dad, and together they had me and my four brothers. And I guess growing up in Otapoti and Dunedin and then moving to Ōtautahi, there was very few Pacific people around. Dad and then a couple of his friends were the only people we knew. And early on, some other influential members of my whānau on my Balangi side had made me feel really angry and upset at being Samoan, that somehow I felt I was a lesser person, having had this other experience that I couldn't quite understand because I didn't grow up in the Pacific in Samoa, even though Aotearoa is in the Pacific. I didn't quite feel that Aotearoa as a Pacific country could articulate that I am also Pacific here. And I guess that was more just who I was around, and including, as I say, some racist family members who made me have this internal self-hatred. And it wasn't until I got to be a little bit later when I was 14 and part of having been to Samoa for the first time. And it was beautiful when people talk about going back to Samoa as though I had never left and or as though I was born there. Was very beautiful to hear from my whānau. And then being part of some Pacific community and youth movements in the city, that actually it all started to shift, where we and me and others could see ourselves that actually to grow up here in Aotearoa as Samoan or as Pacific is actually our reality now. We're not so many people migrating to Aotearoa. It's more we've been born here and grown up here, with more than 60% of us growing up here. And more than 50% of us are also tangata whenua and have that whakapapa. I personally don't, but for those that do, it's like, that's the reality of growing up Pacific here these days. So that's changed a lot. And through those kind of spaces, we've advocated for a clearer reality of who Aotearoa's Pacific people are and what Aotearoa's Pacific responsibilities are. it's only just come across into Hawara, and then I've ended up in some of these spaces, trying to bring our lived experience, which at the start I didn't know would be part of our journey, but it is.
How have you found bringing all of that richness of how to be Pacific here, as you mentioned, to, for example, the journey of the Te Ara Oranga mental health inquiry process? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I was 22 when I got the call. It was 3 days before the panel was announced that I was told that I'd been considered for it, so I didn't know. I didn't put my hand up to be put in the ring. I actually later found out that the government had decided on a panel, and then it had gone to the Prime Minister, and that she had wanted a young person on the panel. And so then they, somehow my name got put up, and then they appointed me. And I didn't know until they said the words that I was appointed. So it was a weird few days. Like, just to go back, I'd been at varsity studying, and I've studied history, but I had taken 6 months off because I had become quite unwell, and I had some really good support from my counsellor, and Andrew's her name, she's phenomenal. But to go from literally being a bouncer at the bar that my dad works at the time, and then after that time rebuilding and renewing with Dad, I guess my own Pacific therapy, and just working alongside him. After 6 months, getting this call 3 days later, I was going to be involved in this mahi. It was pretty crazy. And then going from 6 months earlier, varsity schedules, you might have a couple of classes a week when you're towards the end of your degree. And then you've got lots of reading and thinking to do. I then suddenly started to do 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and then being on call on Sunday, and then and as part of our team, carrying the weight of people's expectations, because the lead up to the inquiry was huge, and meeting whānau who brought their clothes of their bereaved, that they had still kept, and laying them in front of us, and some of the other mamae that can't be understated that's out there, I found very difficult. But as a team, it was quite special. The other 5 panel members helped me understand, because it was something I needed to understand, and they proved to me that we were all wearing all the voices. So we were all wearing Pacific. We were all wearing young people. Like, we all had to be responsible. We all had to be responsible in terms of the voice for whānau hapu iwi. And so I guess going back to what you were asking about Pacific voice, it was complex, but I think I was very well supported in having Dr. Jemima Tiatia Seith there, so that we were doing that together. And that's the opportunity, I think, when it comes to these roles. Just like we wouldn't expect one tangata whenua voice to be the person who carries that. Thankfully, on our panel, we had 3 members who had whakapapa, and when you have Papa Mason on the panel, basically Master Yoda, it kind of, that which you need is there. Plus with Dean and Ron, it was there. So I think that because we were a brown panel, 5 of the 6 of us are Indigenous people, that changed what we said and what's possible from a piece of work like that. And that's, I think, the opportunity of Aotearoa owning its place, and then knowing its connections in the region, that tangata whenua ways of being and knowing, and Pacific ways would only elevate, because that's what's going to solve and help us.
And so we want to learn from your wise counsel about racism and what you've experienced in that domain. You talked about that from your own whānau as a young man, and that it created some sense of self-hatred were the words that you used. So how is that, how have you processed that, and how do you share that, perhaps to help other people learn about the impact of their racism on younger whānau members such as yourself?
Yeah, how I share about it is I try and bring the reality of my story into every setting I'm in. And I know that's the story of many others, that at times we haven't felt we could fully exist as our full self. And I think if we're honest, most New Zealanders would say that there's been a time when they've experienced that. It might just be a bit more confronting when we're talking about a culture or a belief system or a gender and sexual identity that's not something that's immediately in our own whānau, so it's quite hard to understand. But I tell them my story and just encourage them and or those decision makers that, yeah, the choices that we're making are not small choices, and if we're trying to make well-being and our oranga actually real, wouldn't we want everyone to feel like they belong and that they felt connected to something? I suppose when we keep seeing people tell us that they don't have someone to turn to, what does that say about how we're offering people the supports in terms of identity to feel connected to something? And for Pākehā, I mean, the reason I say and want to highlight my Pākehā identity and is for a long time there, I had gone the other way. So I had gone from being totally this internal self-hatred about being Pacific, and then through that support from my whānau to be more confident in who I was. And then I started to feel a cultural cringe about being Mālangi as well. And I think if we're honest, all of our ancestors from whatever background have done bad things. There are some who have done worse things, and there are some of us in our ancestry which continue to perpetuate those bad things, and racism is one of them. And that is that we have the opportunity to be aware that there are systems which enable certain people to get better outcomes, and so I guess that's how I explain through my story. And in trying to be real about what the difficulty of that, owning all of who I am, and then sharing that with others, that they might themselves be more able to talk about their own whakapapa, and whether that's from Ireland or Scotland or somewhere else, and them having special stories about struggling against people telling them they couldn't be the way that they wanted to be. That actually there is this shared global experience. But then we also have to be careful in understanding those stories to not diminish tangata whenua space and place. And yeah, so I guess that's the tension I try and speak about and support in my thinking and the decision making I'm part of.
There's lots of aspects to it, aren't there? And I think sometimes that's what can make pinning down racism hard because of the huge context historically within the locality and within the whānau. I'm interested in your thoughts around what racism actually does to affect our health. So reflecting on your story, some of the threads that I'm hearing are around it attacks the identity, it attacks the connectivity of a person to their ethnic roots. And so how do you understand that mechanism of racism and how it's affected your own personal health and the health of your community?
Yeah. Well, I guess because I didn't feel like I could be proud of what my dad had taught me, and partly because of who some of my whānau were and what they said, and then generally what I felt in the community around me, like a whole knowledge system, a whole way of being, a whole series of protective factors, if we want to talk about it in the biomedical speak. I couldn't access that because I was admitting that the biosocial, that couldn't do it. And then when I couldn't access the Pacific ways, and then the biomedical psychosocial support couldn't help me either, what do I do? And so that confidence in myself that my whānau helped me grow, that I could actually trust that it wasn't about what the Police 10-7 kind of view of who our peoples are, but just in terms of those things which destabilised who I think I could be and who I could aspire to be, when the most well-referenced definition of a Pacific person in my upbringing is Māori or Pacific, male, 20s, such and such an offence.
Kia ora. Yeah. So one of the things that I hear a lot in my mahi as a child and adolescent psychiatrist from rangatahi, especially our young men, is they're not sure how to respond. There is this theme of internalizing the negativity of the self-hatred, the self-loathing, and then what to do with that and how to respond. And particularly our young men are so vulnerable, but also have so much potential. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how have you tried to respond to different kinds of racism that you faced. What advice do you have for other young men in particular from Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, from the Māori community about ways to respond?
Yeah, I think that the hard bit is that we have to stay in it. Like, we have to stay in and face it. If it's something that we are uncomfortable with or uncertain about and trying to understand, we're not going to understand anymore from going away from it. And that's, I think, what you would tell us and many others that I've seen when in my own journey and other young men that we work with, that we also, it's quite important to feel like I'm part of the Samoan class, which meets on a Monday night on Zoom, and that's a really special space where we don't feel like we don't feel like we can't ask the questions we need to ask to understand. I think everybody needs a space where they can do that, and there are some spaces where it's not fair to tangata whenua in particular to be the ones who educate those of us who are tangata tiriti about our responsibilities and what we've done wrong and what we continue to do wrong. And so one of the groups of people that helped me along the way was Network Waitangi Otautahi, a Pākehā treaty education network who create the most beautiful resources that Pākehā and tangata tiriti can draw on, so that we're not sapping up the resources of tangata whenua to help us unlearn and then relearn the things we need to relearn. So that's one of those things I think we can do, and then picking a buddy who's someone to journey in it with us, and that's, I guess, what our Zoom learning group is, but more that we have the Zoom time, and then outside of that there's three of us who meet separate to that to kind of just check in and keep encouraging each other. And there are many days it gets really hard. Like, I know the class is coming at 6 o'clock and I'm like, part of my whakamaa, maybe I don't want to go today. And then that encouragement, and yeah, we all need those encouragers in this.
That's great advice, ngā mihi. I want to touch on your thoughts around the language that we're using around Pacific and specific Pacific nations, because on one hand, could it be seen as racist to be labelling all of the diverse Pacific nations under the korowai of Pacific, Pacifica, rather than actually talking about all the different, the mana of all the different nations within the Pacific? What are your thoughts about that?
It's quite a complex one because, as Dr. Stephen Ratuva will tell you, most of what's happened in the names given to Pacific Islands and in terms of the Pacific regions, even our Pacific people in Aotearoa, we haven't chosen most of what we've been named. So, like, just as a basic 101 for those listening, so Polynesia is the land of many islands, poly being many. Micronesia, the land of small islands. Melanesia, the land of black people. Black people of these black islands. Melanesians did not want to be named that. They did not choose to be named that. They have claimed that in some circumstances, and you see a group called the Melanesian Spearhead Group and others who've kind of working with that. So I guess to touch on our Aotearoa context, Pacific Islanders, which many of us were called in early documents when the government started talking about us in health policy and things, 70s, 80s, that was, and then it sort of has become Pacific peoples. neither of those terms we've chosen. I personally think if anyone is currently using Pacific Islanders in the work in describing Pacific peoples here in Aotearoa, they're out of step with a more closer, better way of defining who Pacific peoples are, because Aotearoa is a Pacific island, but that's not the kind of frame that people were thinking of when they used that kupu.
Kia ora.
And so, when we think of who Pacific peoples, I guess those names have all been given to kind of categorise and make it easier for decision makers to kind of work in.
Who were white.
Yeah, totally. So they've just carried on what's happened in the Pacific and what keeps happening in the Pacific.
And maybe following on from that, the language resonates with an earlier time, doesn't it? The Pacific Islander language. The pejorative use of that phrase makes me hark back to the Dawn Raids period and the recent apology. And I was interested for you to share with us your thoughts about that and stories perhaps from your own whānau about that time.
Yeah, sure. Dad wasn't here in Aotearoa at that time, but he experienced something quite different, but also I don't think is disconnected. And he would be comfortable with me sharing this, but he, when he came, the immigration officer put pressure on him to do particular things, which I can't say much more about, but just particular things that would not be considered normal and European migrants in New Zealand would not have to experience. They got in his life and manipulated him. I guess there's a lot of power that decision makers have and authority has, and the apology is an important signal, isn't it? That when the state abuses its power and doesn't act in a way that honours te tiriti, because I think that's what it comes back down to. Yeah, te tiriti, a first foreign policy, I think. But that should be how everything is centred. And the manaakitanga that te tiriti extends in enabling us to be here is totally not what the state does, and when it does what it did with the Dawn Raids, when it did what it did to Dad, and then the other health and other outcomes we see. So an apology is a good outcome that the community have called for. I hope though that all decision makers would take notice and respond to the apology and how they work. Like Aotearoa is a Pacific country, and there's Pacific relationships that we have. New Zealand still has a colony. It's called Tokelau. Most New Zealanders don't know that we have a colony. A few years ago, there was a helicopter that the Tokelauan government wanted to buy, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in New Zealand blocked the helicopter. Now, I don't know if the helicopter would have actually suited the purpose that it was bought for, because that was the problem the ministry had. But the thing is, why would you just not talk to the Tokelauan community and work it through with them? And that's not foreign affairs to me, because these are New Zealand citizens, and it is current colony. And then there's these other Pacific relationships that exist. So I guess the Dawn Raids apology has to be a stepping off point for a better understanding that it's not foreign affairs, it's whānau affairs, and re-elevating the approach that the mana whenua have had in the beautiful extension of that whakawhanaungatanga relationship that's existed pre-te tiriti. Where iwi are able to recite off how they entered Aotearoa through different islands they've been through. That's the kind of reset that I hope everyone would try and achieve through the Dawn Raids apology being a beginning of.
Kia ora. Do you see that, there's been a lot of talk about, importantly, about the curriculum in schools and the histories of New Zealand being told, and a lot of focus has been on the history of Māori people, of our people, and I think from what you're saying, it's extremely important that our tamariki mokopuna grow up with knowing the history of Te Mana Nui a Kiwa, because of all of those important aspects that are being played out now. Would you agree with that approach?
Yeah, totally. I guess the other special thing is I think some people forget that, and we certainly don't talk about when I was at school, and I helped to currently write the curriculum for the civics education, so I know what's there and what didn't exist before 2020 when we wrote that. That relationship between tangata whenua and tangata ole moana or tangata moana, that it's kind of not being taught about, and it's weird that as cousins, that people in Aotearoa wouldn't know we're cousins, and that kids wouldn't grow up and think, actually, why shouldn't I go back to the Cook Islands if that's where my iwi have journeyed through, and or Samoa, and others have pilgrimages to different places, and just that sense of that we have more connection than just on the whenua here. For tangata whenua is that connection to the Pacific as well, and I think all of Aotearoa should support tangata whenua to be able to experience that reconnection in the Pacific, and then generally Aotearoa can get on board and then not see the Pacific as neighbours and see Pacific Islands as whānau because they are, and Te Asa Tokelau, which is still a New Zealand colony. Yeah.
It definitely resonates with what you were saying earlier about the sense of whānau connectivity being a protective factor and working against racism. Do you have any final comments about your aspirations as a young leader for our rangatahi who are listening, who are watching, about how they can safely bring their very important, their vital voices forward in this wider community discussion about getting rid of racism?
I think the bit that I've seen which makes a lot of difference is when we ask the questions, whatever the questions are, and I know many people would encourage us to do that, but I guess we can ask the questions in the place that we are most specially have learned about or trained in. I think sometimes we think that we have to do anti-racism work or decolonisation work somewhere else, but we can just do it in the spaces that we're in. So I try and bring that into health, so that hopefully ends up being more like hauora, and then the foreign affairs or anywhere. But I think we think it's somewhere else. So starting at home might be tough, but with my racist whānau, we're getting much closer to them understanding, and they will now, when we're talking about my bank account, use my full last name. So that's good, and and other things. But just as an example, people want to change, I think, if they are given the opportunity to understand how the change is in their interest. And I hate capitalism, but at the same time, I think sometimes we've just got to use the capitalist argument to then win them over, that actually it ends up being in the economic best interest. So I guess let's be tactical about how we talk about it so that people get on board, and then get our kind of the way that would actually centre things better for everyone as well.
Ka pai. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe te rangatira. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for being with us through this really fascinating discussion. And if you want to know more, check out our website. Ka kite.